So in chapter 6, we're going to talk about how to design a good survey. And there's a lot, it's a very simple process, but a very systematic process that involves a lot of steps to make sure that we're getting at good questions. And when we're asking about a good question, we also have to ask what is the goal of the person asking the question. A lot of questions that we see in polls actually aren't meant to be objective. They're meant to send you down a particular role. They're meant to send you down a particular path and deciding um, basically to support one position or another. If we're truly trying to get at people's honest reactions to something, we want to be very careful that we're not communicating through our language, through the questions we ask, what we're actually expecting. In other words, we want to come at this from as a neutral a position as possible, and that's what we're going to be looking at here. So the reverse of this, how to actually create questions that may indeed be leading in a direction, is not what we're going to be covering this chapter. We're assuming that the person designing this survey, designing these questions, designing this measure, if you will, are being driven by a desire to get at honest and accurate responses. So we're going to talk about surveys. We're also going to talk a little bit about observations and how observations and surveys are different. But first, we're going to start on surveys. And again, what we're looking at when we're doing surveys and observations in psychology is we're trying to describe how people feel, what people do, and what their attitudes are. So a lot of times what we're looking at is just the construct validity of surveys and polls. So does it actually look like it's measuring what we're measuring? Um, so a lot of times we also have to think about what are the biases that are built into this. So for example, if someone's reviewing something, for example, customer reviews 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 stars, at that point, we can probably be pretty clear that this is the construct that we're interested in. Our construct is how much were people happy with the product, 5 stars being the most, 1 star being the least. Now, we do want to ask, what about the people filling out these surveys? I've often heard that 1 star reviews tell you more about the person leaving the review than the actual product. Now, that could be true. It could also be false. But what we do know is that generally speaking, we kind of find bimodal distributions in customer reviews. In other words, we tend to find very good and very poor reviews. And the reason for this is if you're just about the product, are you going to take the time to leave a customer review? Generally, people are going to leave reviews when they're either very impressed or they're very dissatisfied. Another example here is teaching evaluations. Share your thoughts. For example, the University of Delaware has an example here. And again, we have to think about, are people that are just okay with the class likely to fill out surveys? Again, we tend to find bimodal distributions. This doesn't mean that the questionnaire is wrong. This means the people taking it have a stake in it. Those that are very happy are likely to fill it out, and those that are very unhappy are likely to fill it out. We're unlikely to get that middle population. So we also want to recognize that. So it's not just construct validity, there's other questions to be asked. So when we're asking questions, we have some big decisions to make as far as the formats that we're going to ask in them. Open-ended questions generally tend to be ones that where we get more rich detail. An open-ended question is basically one that does not have a response option. It asks a question and then there's a blank for someone to put as much or as little as they want. So I might, for example, ask, what are your opinions about the current situations involving Cuba in the current politics? Now, you may just simply say, I have no idea, and then you write out, I have no idea. You might actually put positive opinions, you may put negative opinions, you may put fears, you may put paragraphs, you may just put not applicable. I don't have an attitude. So the advantage to open-ended questions is we tend to get much more rich information. The downside is it's a lot harder to process. What do people mean, especially if we're asking that question of multiple people? So we tend to use open-ended questions, especially if we're looking at large groups of people filling out a survey, relatively carefully. We might ask a few clarifying questions at the end. We tend to use open-ended questions more when we're dealing with small populations. Most common is the forced choice format. Forced choice is a broad range of response options, but it basically means you don't write out a response, you simply respond to the question. It can be a yes, no, a true, false. It can be a 1 to 5 scale. It can be 4 options and you're supposed to choose the best. There's a lot of different options in forced choice. But all forced choice refers to is that you are forced to make a decision. You're not providing your own responses. You're responding at a existing response option. So the most common form of this is the Likert scale, and it is pronounced Likert. A lot of times you'll hear Likert, and there's not really anything wrong with this, but it's actually named after a person's last name, and that last name was pronounced Likert. The Likert scale typically is a strongly agree to strongly disagree scale, and a true Likert scale is strongly agree or strongly disagree, disagree, neither, agree, strongly agree on a 5-point scale. Likert-like scales can be 4-point scales, 3-point scales, 7-point scales, 9-point scales. Again, they can vary, and also what the response options, strongly agree, to strongly disagree, or very strongly agree to very strongly disagree, to even options that do not agree, do not involve disagree or agree. The biggest thing is to know if you have a Likert-like scale is that it should be balanced. It should be negative and positive, and it should be an equal number of items that are negative and an equal number of items that are positive, and they should be in the same format. The reverse of this is the semantic differential format, an example shown below. In this case, we actually do not have a balanced scale. So in a Likert-like scale, the midpoint is the midpoint. In a semantic differential scale, it's basically a range, if you will, from one extreme to the other. So easiness might be from easy to hard, with 1 being easy, 2 being a little less easy, 3 being less easy, 4 being harder, and 5 being the hardest. It might be helpfulness, useless to very helpful. It might be clarity, confusing to crystal clear. Notice one of the things is whether this is a 5-point scale, a 4-point scale, a 7-point scale, generally speaking, the midpoint doesn't mean neutral. The midpoint is simply on the spectrum, if you will. So semantic differential scales usually take more items to ask the question, but can be a little more accurate depending on what you're asking. So let's talk about writing well-worded questions, well-worded questions. There's a couple of things that we want to be thinking of. The first one is leading questions. A leading question lets someone know how they're supposed to respond. So for example, if you see a question that says, like most people, or the majority agrees, what is your opinion? That's a leading question. That's telling people how they're socially supposed to be responding, or how most people respond. If your question has any indication of whether someone should agree or disagree, that might be great if you're trying to do public opinion polling for a particular political party. It is not a great way to get actual information. The next one is double-barreled questions. So in an effort to make our questionnaires shorter, and the reason to make them shorter is the shorter typically is going to get better results. That doesn't mean 1 or 2 items, but as you get more and more questions, you start to run into something that's called questionnaire fatigue. And you can probably experience this yourself. If you're taking a questionnaire and it's got 5, 10, or 15 questions, that's usually fine. But if you've hit the 3rd page of 20 questions, so you're at 60, you start to wonder, how many questions are they going to ask me? That is driven, that problem drives double-barreled questions. It's an attempt to make a single question simpler and easier, but it actually makes it more complex. What a double-barreled question is any question that has a conjunctive in it, or, and, is something you want to look at very carefully. Because what it means is we're probably asking more than one question. For example, do you agree with the current political party, and would you vote for people from that party? That's 2 separate questions. Someone might disagree with the party, but still be willing to vote for them for other reasons. So again, we want to look for any time that we're asking more than one question. Each question should be a single concept, one question. We want to avoid these double-barrel questions. We also want to avoid negative wording. Negative wording basically refers to any time that we have complexity in the question. So it's harder for people to answer a negative question. I would not vote for this person. Instead, just simply, would you vote for this person? So anytime you see no's or negative adjectives in a question, think about, is this a negatively worded question? Now, that doesn't mean that we will never use negative wording questions, but we want to make sure that they are used very sparingly. And finally, we want to think about question order. It actually has been found that the order you ask questions can influence how people respond. This is one of the reasons that a lot of surveys don't actually have a typical order. It's randomized. So how the order you get questions is always going to be different from each person. So for example, if you have a question that actually has an anchor in it, and an anchor would be, for example, something that makes you start to think. So if I asked you, what is the length of the longest river? You might think to yourself, probably 3,000 miles. That's an anchor. Even the answer is an anchor. So you now have 3,000 in your mind. If my next question is, how much money would you accept to vote against your conscience? Guess what? That question is probably going to be responded to based on that previous question. That numerical answer of 3,000 now becomes an anchor. So again, we have to think about question wording, specifically if questions are providing particular anchors. So for example, again, in a question where we're looking at um, psychological constructs, if we have a series of questions that mildly ask about negative opinions, and someone's starting to kind of go, well, I sort of agree with that, but then we have a question that is strongly worded about a negative opinion, depending on the order of that question, if that question is first, someone's going to probably respond, absolutely not. And therefore, the more subtle questions, they're going to respond more negatively. If we have those subtle questions first, they may start to move towards a more accurate response and then reject, or maybe even be willing to admit to a slight agreement with that more negatively worded or more strongly worded question. So again, we want to think about question order when we're creating a survey. Even the words we use can definitely affect how people respond. And this is used in politics constantly. You'll notice that very rarely do both Democrats and Republicans refer to something with the same name. They usually use different terms. For example, they may actually be using, we'll talk about, for example, the concept of abortion. We have right to life or right to choose. Notice those are two different terms for the same concept. And the reason for that is people respond differently. It's hard for you to negatively respond that you aren't for the right to life, but it's also hard to respond negatively that you're not for the right to choose. So for example, just looking at this recent poll done by the Philadelphia Inquirer, the first question was, what are your feelings towards Obamacare? The second one was, what are your feelings towards the Affordable Care Act? Take a look at those percentages. They do shift. So 46% were negative on Obamacare, but only 37% were actually negative on the Affordable Care Act. So again, we want to think about how we're using terms. Generally speaking, we want to find something that is devoid of politics, if you will. In other words, I probably wouldn't use Affordable Care Act or Obamacare. I would probably simply ask, what are your feelings towards government-funded health care? Just keep it as simple as level as possible. If you're using terms that are being used by other parties or other groups, they've probably already done their research to find what terms actually cause people to respond in the way that they're wanting to present. So if we're encouraging accurate responses, we want to create our surveys in the best way possible. So the first thing is using shortcuts and response sets. So I already mentioned that we do run into survey fatigue. The best way to truly get at someone's feelings is to ask them lots and lots of questions. However, the more questions we ask, the more likely they start to stop responding. So we want to be working on making sure that we don't ask questions that they wouldn't have answers to. In other words, non-differentiation. In other words, if someone doesn't really know, or we're asking questions that just really aren't relevant to that person's experiences, there's a very good chance they're just going to respond in the middle, and that's not going to differentiate them from anyone else. We also want to work at making sure that we are not providing questions where people just agree all the time, acquiescence or yay saying. And we also want to make sure that we're creating questions that don't allow a lot of fence sitting. Fence sitting basically, again, means that responding in the middle. We also want to think about if there are questions that we want to ask some people, but not everyone. So for example, if it's a subset or a shortcut, we might ask people, are you interested in governmental funded health care? If yes, here's 5 more questions. If no, we skip those 5 questions. We also want to make sure that we're not communicating how to look good or socially desirable. There's a famous study that actually asked people to secretly put whether or not they actually were willing to exclude certain people from living in their neighborhoods. It was basically, this was done in the 60s, but it was a measure of racial bigotry, if you will, racism. And when people responded secretly, there was no way to know who responded. They gathered those responses. So they basically sent out sheets of paper, had everyone rank how willing or unwilling they were to have people from a certain group live in their town, and they collected those options. So no one put their names on them. They then asked everyone to stand up, and anyone that would reject anyone from living in their neighborhood, go to the right, and anyone that would let anyone live in their neighborhood, go to the left. Guess what? Everyone went to the left. No one was willing to be outed as socially undesirable. However, when they looked at the actual anonymous responses, they actually found 33% were unwilling to let people move into their neighborhoods. So we also want to think about how do we actually set up questions that do not communicate. And this would be, again, an example of a leading question. What is the socially desirable? And there are times when we're asking questions that are socially desirable. We want to think about how can we actually word those questions in a way that people are more likely to give us their actual responses. And one of those ways is to let them know that it's anonymous. There's no way their responses could be connected to them. We also want to make sure we're not asking them questions that they don't really know, so saying more than they can know. If we're asking questions about something that requires a specific set of skills, we want to make sure that sample is based on those specific skills. And finally, we also need to recognize that our own memory of events can be poor. So for example, again, a famous study of this in the 60s and 70s was actually looking at how people reported their drinking. So there was two measures here. First, everyone that was being measured was actually being observed at the bars. In other words, observers watched how many drinks they had. And then 3 days later, people were asked to report how many drinks they had. They actually underreported the number of drinks they actually had in reality. So again, when our surveys are based on memories of events, we can expect people to respond poorly. We find the same response of memory for events when we ask people about their number of sexual partners. We typically find that people tend to either exaggerate or actually reduce those numbers when they're reporting. And that doesn't necessarily mean they're lying. It could also be that their legitimate memories of these events are actually being affected. So let's talk a little bit about the other alternative, behavioral observations. So if asking people surveys and asking them questions can be fraught with landmines, if you will, as we are carefully making sure that we do not ask questions that let people know how to respond, maybe the response is to observe. And in fact, two of the examples I used of experiments where they did this and they tested how fallible surveys could be, they compared those results with observations. So observations can be better than self-reports, but a couple of things to note. The first one is, before we even get down to the problems with observations, some things are hard to observe. If we're asking someone their attitudes, are we able to watch them for long enough to actually get an observation of those attitudes? Or would it make more sense simply to ask them? We also need to have to recognize that there are observer biases, observer effects, and reactivity. Observer bias means that we have a tendency, we're people after all, we're not perfect machines, which means that if we're observing, we have a tendency, especially if we know our hypothesis, to notice behaviors that reinforce our beliefs and maybe discount behaviors that don't. So this is especially true if we're looking at observations of less than verbal behaviors. If I'm simply watching how many times someone completes a drink, that's relatively easy. We can have observers watch that behavior and probably come up with very similar answers. But if I'm looking for aggressive behaviors, if I'm wanting to see those aggressive behaviors, I may actually count more behaviors as aggressive than if I'm not looking for aggressive behaviors, where I'm more likely to not count things as aggressive unless they're overtly so. That would be observer bias. The observer effect means that people do behave differently, and this goes in with reactivity. So basically, observer effects means that when we're observing something, we're also affecting it. And the reactivity is referring to people actually reacting differently when they're being observed. One of the best examples of this is a true classic study that was done almost, well, over 100 years ago, and I'm going to talk about that one next. And that is the case of Clever Hans. Clever Hans was a horse, and Clever Hans was an amazing horse. What Clever Hans could do was just about anything. You came up and asked Clever Hans any question in any language, math, complex philosophy, politics, and he would respond with hoof clomps to the right answer. So for example, if you asked him what 3 plus 3 was, 3 plus 3, and you said, now answer, he'd clap once, he'd clap twice, he'd clap 3 times, he'd clap 4 times, he'd clap 5 times, he'd clap 6 times, he would stop. He would stop on the correct answer. So as long as you asked him a question that could be answered by numbers of clumps, he was almost always correct. So observers were amazed by this. PhDs started to research. In fact, it started to create a fervor of maybe animals are far smarter than we think they are. They're just not capable of verbally communicating. That was until a graduate student actually started to ask, how could a horse with a known cranial size of a brain that is much smaller than what we associate with true intelligence, not only be a master of all of these things, be answering questions that they couldn't know about? In other words, they were answering questions about deep politics in other countries that they had no experience with. They were responding to people that were asking them questions in different languages, which meant they also understood languages. So basically, he created a double blind study where people came up and asked Clever Hans questions that they didn't know the answer to. Clever Hans would wait for the question to end, and then he'd start to clomp, and he would continue, and he would never stop. It turns out that Clever Hans was a very clever horse. He had learned that when he clomps to the right answer, people would slightly lean in, their eyes would slightly widen, their irises would go a little bit big, and that's when he would stop. He hadn't learned all of these complex notations of mathematics and politics. He hadn't learned multiple languages. He had learned something very simple about human behavior. Humans are impressed when you get something right. This is a very good example that observations have to be very careful as well. When observers see what they expect to see, when participants confirm those observation expectations, and when participants react to being watched, that's what we have to be very careful of. So again, when we talk about those again, observer bias is when observers see what they expect to see. Observer effects are where participants simply confirm the observer's expectations. In other words, they figure out what's going on. Clever Hans figured out he was in an experiment and also figured out how to respond properly to get the proper response. And not only that, he was being rewarded. Whenever he got a question right, he would get a little treat. He would get a carrot from his handlers. Clever Hans was a very clever horse. And finally, reactivity. He was the participant and he was reacting to how he was being observed. So for chapter 6 assignment, it's pretty straightforward. You're going to read through what's being presented, and I'm asking you to come up with what are your concerns of the researchers who conducted this observational research. So describe the researchers and think about what kind of bias they might have. How did they actually set up their study, and what kind of biases that we just discussed could be introduced. We want to talk then, I want you to ask, how did Dr. Pottigel and Green observe and measure tantrum noises without being intrusive? What was the issue in this attempt to prevent? In other words, what were they doing to not be intrusive? In other words, not let the people know they were being observed, and what were they trying to avoid by doing this? And finally, what kind of reliability would need to be established in this research? In other words, what kind of reliability are you looking for when we're looking at multiple observers? So hopefully that'll help you in that assignment. All the information is provided in the assignment, and I'm looking forward to reading everyone's response. Thank you.